The 5 Hive Plateau, 964 AAW. Oregon Kairaisi pushed open the door to the council's chambers, ignoring the bleats of the Methiumum guards. Weren't they supposed to prevent anyone unauthorized getting in? But then, that was the whole problem, wasn't it? The Council of the Magi wasn't helping the assembly of species like it used to. They told new Magi like him to mind their business and stay in the Nether, rather than seeing the profundity of the homeworlds. He shook off the guard's hand, catching at the sleeve of his robe, though the hand fell away as the guards hastily returned to their posts. They saw what he did. Oregon's steps slowed as the 6 counselors of the Magi, one for each house, stared up at him. They had been in the middle of arguing about something, gathered around the table from which they presided over the rest of the Magi. Trills and glissandos in the House of Power reflected the vestiges of the argument before the symphony escaped his perception. He grasped after the fading notes, but if he was truthful, and he always was, those gazes unnerved him. His fingers crumpled the newsprint he held in his left hand. It was the latest example of the Council refusing to send Magi where they were needed. There had been 3 natural disasters in the last 2 cycles where the Council did nothing to help. They cited the force of Magi was spread too thin already.
Magus Kairaisi, why are you to be breaking into our meeting unannounced in a dirty robe? Again?
Maverlucci Karindi looked down her hooked nose at him, her crest spreading in an intimidating display. The leader of the council, and the head of his primary house, the House of Communication, was a Kyrian like him, and seemed always to think he was lacking. He still hadn't figured out why. He only wanted the council to afford him a little recognition.
Speaker Karindi, I was reading the latest report from one of the local newspapers of the continuing conflict on the Pixie homeworld.
He brandished the print, sparing a glance for the sleeve of his robe as he did. A stain from his breakfast of meal grubs and broth ran between lines of crimson and purple. The stain was nearly hidden against the background. Speaker Karindi must have the eyes of an eagle. Or she was looking for some deficiency, more likely. Oregon's own crest drooped under her stare.
"And what of this story, pup?"
asked the head of the House of Strength. Jazz Rimapontoire, grower, was a large festoor woman, her fur decked with silver rings worked into braids, and an enormous pink hat perched on her head. Her bright blue eyes glared at him from underneath. She was usually even-tempered. He must have caught them at something important then. The only way through was forward. Oregon pushed his crest back up, propping up his confidence. If the council accepted his case, it would be something to share with the other Magi.
"Well, why is the council not sending a representative to end the fight?"
He waved the newsprint for emphasis, and several sets of eyes followed the movement.
"Another Hive outpost was burned yesterday, and 200 pixies killed. The pixie speakers were livid.
The council, we do attend the assembly meetings,"
Councillor Zana, head of the House of Healing, said. He was bolt upright in his chair, as if to show off every speck of his diminutive height. The cowl that hid his face shifted as he spoke.
"Yes, certain pixie representatives, they have asked for aid. But the council has determined it is a local matter for the pixies, not big enough for the Magi to step in."
What could the Magi be doing that an army could not,
Speaker Karindi added.
Magi are not trained for war. Magi are trained to spread knowledge, to teach, and to be providing relief from natural disasters. "But this,"
he started. "Is not a natural disaster, Magus Kairaisi," Councillor Huar said, sitting back with one hand on her hat to keep it from flapping off her head like a deranged bird. "This is pure social conflict between 2 different philosophical factions. The Magi cannot get involved. It would show favor to one species over another. Everyone would want us to win their wars for them." Oregon's hands flexed, crumpling the newsprint further. When the Luthenia Dam on Etan burst not 6 months ago, which had been a natural disaster, the council sent no Magi. 28 Etanala perished. If he had been there, well, he wasn't certain what he would have done, but he would have at least tried. He stared down at the carving on the front of the huge table, a relief of all the species of the Great Assembly, working in harmony to raise a tower. The species who joined later surrounded the 6 original species who formed the Assembly. Kyrians were one of the first, along with Methiemum and Festur. The Pixies, however, were on the outskirts of the carving. The only species farther away from the central work was a figure of a lopal. That strange species only joined the Assembly 12 cycles past.
"It is not escaping my attention that there has never been a pixie on the Council of the Magi," Oregon said. "Would such a councillor be having a differing opinion?"
It was a common stereotype to think pixies were little smarter than animals. Their buzzing wings and high energy did not help that perception. But it was the warrior caste of the pixies, the ones who were now killing their kind on Mother Hive, who were the most vicious of their species. Many pixies were hard-working, quick-thinking, sparks of energy. He had spoken to dozens, some of who rightly belonged in the research labs connected to the House of Power. But he found them when he walked at the docks of the Imperium. It was the only place many pixies could get work.
"We ain't sending anyone, so stop asking," Councillor Huar grumped. "The people in the Nether are to be prejudiced against pixies," Oregon pleaded. He really had to control his crest. "They are not all like the ruffians who have been vandalizing the shops in mid-Imperium. Those are the warrior-minded variety. There are at least—"
He stopped and checked the news article again.
15 known aspirations of pixie. It is how they are to be organizing their society. But the warriors have been culling the other classes, somehow on the Hive Plateau. That is why the council should be sending—"
"Enough, Magus Caraci,"
Councillor Zana said, his voice rising. The councillors for the houses of Grace and Potential on his right and left, both Methiemum, rolled their eyes in unison. Oregon felt his crest bristle. This was not some joke.
"Even 2 or 3 Magi would be making a You are excused, Magus Caraci,"
Speaker Karindi broke in. Her crest was dangerously low, her eyes narrowed. The other 5 councillors stared him down, flanking her. Their abandoned papers nearly covered the top of the table.
"Well, I would not be wishing to take any more of your precious time," he shot back. "Speaker, councillors."
Oregon gave a mocking bow, twirled, and stomped out of the chamber. Oregon stumped down the steps of the Spire of the Magi, where the council chambers were. It was a colossal building, even taller than the House of Communication, built around one of the sparkling semi-transparent columns that held up the crystal expanse of the Nether. Once outside, Oregon took in a deep breath of the clear air of the Nether. He opened himself up to the music underlying the universe as he crossed the grounds from the Spire of the Magi to the House of Communication. It was almost midday, and the titanic walls encasing 2 sides of the Nether's capital city of the Imperium were at their maximum brightness. They reflected off the other houses of the Magi, 6 in total, that circled the spire. Strength, communication, power, grace, healing, and potential. The Magi lived like royalty because they protected and helped the 10 species of the Assembly. They were supposed to, anyway. Yet pleas from the Magi to their councillors as often as not went unheard. Oregon spared a glance down at the arm of his robe. So what if it was dirty? It was typical for the councillors to focus on the wrong problems when the more urgent one was staring them in the face. They wouldn't be able to solve the Assembly's problem if their ancestors led them by the nose. Oregon stopped in the middle of the sculpted grounds between the spire and the House of Communication. He'd recently found an apartment on the 2nd floor, after moving out of his old mentor's rooms, but now he looked upward, along the many floors of the tower. It was the tallest of the houses, reflecting the symphony of communication's connection to matters of the air. Someday, when he had a little more authority, he'd get a more auspicious room. He belonged to 2 houses, not just one like most Magi. He could have lived in the House of Power, if he really wanted to, but it was his 2nd house, after all. He spared a glance for the low, sturdy structure of the House of Power. It was next door to the House of Communication. His choice was not just because the new Magi in the House of Power thought his grasp of the connections of power were basic and worse than an apprentice's. He'd like to see those Magi try to separate two of the fractal symphonies that made up the universe. They only had to deal with one. He should start a club or something, to help support the few other Magi who could hear two aspects of the Grand Symphony. There weren't many, but he felt there should be more attention paid to them. There were so many possibilities when hearing more of the Grand Symphony. Oregon's crest flexed in remembered embarrassment, and he tried unsuccessfully to rein it in. The other species did not have such an expressive means of communication as the crests which graced Kyrian heads. However, that also meant it was easier for them to hide their feelings. Oregon pushed back several out-of-place feathers. Now his eyes swept across the carefully tended grounds around the spire, with peaceful streams, thought-provoking sculptures, and surprise turns in the rolling walkways leading to scenic views. How unlike the war-torn homeworld of the Pixies. Well, was he a Magus, or wasn't he? Oregon turned away from the House of Communication. He stalked up to the Magus attendant at the portal ground. The spire had its own portal ground, another privilege given to the Magi. The attendant was a Wari Loboth, the third gender of that species, though he wasn't familiar with here personally. Z was an older Magus.
"I want to go here."
He pointed at the drawing in the newsprint, of a high plateau between giant mounds of dirt, reaching as high as the spire of the Magi, from what he could tell. The Magus on duty peered at the picture, though her eyes did not narrow. Loboth's silvery eyes always looked surprised to him. To be a portal ground attendant required an extensive knowledge of locations on the 10 homeworlds, to provide travel to wherever the customer required. Someday, Oregon hoped to amass that sort of knowledge. Of course, as a Magus, he could travel for free by portal to wherever he wished. Non-Magi had to pay a fee to cover the Magus's time in operating the ground. Magi were expected to fill in that role once they had enough knowledge of places to go. One could only make a portal to a place one previously visited, or a place to which another Magus communicated the coordinates.
"That's the 5-Hive Plateau,"
the Magus said. Her head tentacles were wound tight around the top of her head.
"There's a war going on amongst the Pixies. I wouldn't want to be caught in the middle."
"That is why you are not to be going,"
Oregon told her.
"None of the other Magi seem to care either, so I am going to help."
The Loboth shrugged.
"It's your head. If the council gave you permission to go there, who am I to argue?"
Oregon desperately forced his crest down so he wouldn't look like a juvenile caught outside the hatchery after curfew.
"I was just to be coming from the council chamber,"
he said evasively. The Loboth shrugged again, impressive for one with practically no neck, and turned around, an oblong of black forming behind here, ringed in blue and amber. Oregon could just hear notes at the edge of his perception. The Magus was of the House of Grace, an aspect of the Grand Symphony he couldn't hear, but portals were common to all Magi, somehow, and there was a little overlap when a Magus of another house opened one. Oregon stepped through the oval of blackness and immediately felt the feathers on his head separate in the dryness and heat. It was a good thing he had decided not to grow a mustache. It would have been severely itchy in this weather. The portal closed behind him with a little pop, and he looked around the desolate, reddish plain of Mother Hive. There was no Magus attendant on this side. He could see the hives in the distance, towering things unlike the picture in the newsprint. That had shown mounds of dirt, like an animal could have piled up. The reality was much different. Even from this distance, he could see exquisite carvings on the outside of the hives. They were a history, he thought, a progression of figures and places parading around the circumference, with some aspects coated in paint or precious metals. The carvings made way for the multitude of entrances around the hive, and as Oregon took a few steps closer, peering, he could make out dozens, no, hundreds of figures swarming around the outside of the hive. A growing roar made him pause. He turned to find another hive to his left, and behind him was an army of pixies coming his way. There was no time to react. Oregon yelped and crouched down as a swarm of buzzing wings and shoving arms engulfed him. He dodged to one side as a sword as big as the pixie wielding it sliced through the space where his crest had been a moment before. Fortunately, the combatants were too focused on battling each other to pay him much attention. He was treated mostly as an obstacle, though he had to shake off a pixie who landed on his back and tried to use him as a shield. There were no colors surrounding people or objects that would signal magi were involved. These must all be common soldiers, but their weapons were still sharp. A pair of the bluish, buzzing creatures, half his height, flew over his head. Their short swords flashed faster than he could follow, pinging off each other like a pair of giant enraged hornets. What could he do? Eventually he'd get skewered, and then how would he help these people in their battle? He fell into the symphony of communication, which was a riot of sound, with chords playing over each other and cadenzas doing as much battle musically as the bodies around him. Fighting was a means of communication, and so was the air around them. Oregon frantically took notes from the core of his being, generated by everything he experienced, and stuffed them between separations in the measures. A shield of air puffed into existence around him, and the sounds of battle died away to a muted rumble. The yellow of the House of Communication, visible only to magi, swirled along the outside of the shield. Oregon slumped, brushing dust off his robe, though more landed even as he did. The wings of the pixies generated strangely tall twists of air, but at least they were outside his bubble. He watched the ballet of death around him, in a circle of empty space. Except now, he labored for every breath. Oregon's feathers felt like they might burst into flame. Sweat soaked him. Why was it so hot? A spear thrust through the side of the shield, and Oregon jigged away, narrowly avoiding another hole in his robe and in his side. This shield of air was not nearly as effective as his mentor implied. Ah! Oregon's crest rose in triumph. It was the pressure, simple thermodynamics. Another thing he hadn't been told when shown the trick with the shield of air. Well, he could hear more than just the symphony of communication, couldn't he? Oregon took more of his notes, this time listening to the symphony of power. It was concerned with the connections between things, and one of those things was how heat moved around. He waded through measures detailing the shifting flows of the battle. One side was definitely winning, though he didn't know who or what they represented. Oregon found the legato phrases, slow and stagnant, defining the inside of the sphere, and changed the tempo of several measures, pushing the heat away from him and into the wall of air until it was even cooler inside than it was on the plateau. Quite by coincidence, it further opened the spaces in the music of the air, and Oregon stuffed more notes into the symphony of communication. His shield now had another aura of orange, for the House of Power, to match the yellow. It indicated where his circle of protection ended. This time, when a spear stabbed at the shield, it skidded off the hardened air, dragging the pixie wielding it off balance. Her compound eyes flashed in anger. Success! The shield wouldn't last forever. Oregon heard degradation of the notes when the spear impacted, but he could take a moment to figure out what was going on without his robe gaining more holes than greens attacked by grubs. Oregon tugged his sleeves down so his wrists were properly covered, and spun in a circle, observing the fight. Now he had a moment to watch. He noted the phenotypical differences of the two parties fighting. One faction was brighter blue, and the chitinous places covering their skin had natural sharpened points. The other, smaller faction was smoother looking, and he thought their compound eyes might be larger. The spikier ones also had better armor, harnesses around their chests and shoulders with purple metallic plates. The others had nothing so organized, and many lacked armor at all, relying on their naturally hard skin. The better-clad ones were winning, and Oregon would make a wager they were the warrior caste who'd been causing so much trouble. But that meant the fight was spreading dangerously fast through the plateau. If only the council had listened to him. He called out to the nearest non-warrior, hoping she could understand the common tongue. He wasn't in the Nether anymore, with its inherent translation between species.
Which is to be the correct way to your hive?
The pixie started, turning multifaceted eyes toward him. Evidently she understood.
Why, here, magus. We applied for help. None came. Now you plop down in the middle of a battle we lose. I am to be here now,
Oregon answered. He tried to keep his crest level, as a warrior banged on the top of his shield with a hefty warhammer. He could hear the blows banging notes out of existence, crumpling them from 8th to 16th to 32nd notes.
Simply tell me what to do, and I will be helping.
If the warriors didn't kill him first, that was. The pixie sneered at him and buzzed away, running face first into a knot of warriors. Oregon winced as blades came at her from 3 sides, then dug into the symphony of communication. It was farther away, but he could still hear the melody of the air tumbling around them in a violent caprice. He redirected a few phrases with his notes, and wind caught the flats of the blades, moving them enough to narrowly miss her. The pixie countered and thrust back, hitting one warrior in her armored breastplate, but the pixie's strike slid off. Oregon could see the blades coming in again, and again he tried to change the symphony, but it resisted his efforts. What he attempted was too similar to what he had done before. The symphony was getting muddy with his alterations. Oregon watched in horror as the pixie he addressed was cut down in seconds. He could do little from where he was. He was no warrior, though he could handle himself in a fight. Still, he alone would not make a difference in this battle. If the council sent more magi, however... The warhammer was still knocking notes from their places in his shield, and Oregon turned a glare upward, his crest expanding. He delved back into the symphony of power. This music was fresher than the music of communication. A few more of his notes to increase the tempo of the warhammer's melody, and it heated until it glowed. The pixie warrior swore and dropped her weapon. Oregon reversed the change he'd made to the symphony, taking his notes back into his core. He breathed easier, feeling less spent. He'd need to make sure he didn't overreach. That had always been a failing of his in university. Change too many things at once, and use too many notes, and what was left? No, this fight didn't need him. It was already lost. The warriors were chasing down the remnants of the smaller army. He looked toward his original objective, the hive with the elaborate carvings around its circumference. He was nearly sure it was the one to host a scientific-minded faction of the 5 hives. As he recalled, the warriors had taken over several others already. If the pixies' history was accurate, they developed this part of their homeworld 2,500 cycles past, long before they were part of the assembly, when one hive mother birthed an unheard-of 5 hive daughters at once. The plateau where they settled became a hub for commerce with the other species of the assembly, until this war started. If he stopped it, commerce from Mother Hive would flow again. The council would have to acknowledge what he'd done. The hive mother was the key. From what he knew, she was the way to influence the hive. He definitely couldn't reach the warrior mother, but he might reach the mother for the losing side. Oregon listened to the music defining his shield. The pixies couldn't harm him right now, but if he left the shield's protection, he wouldn't last long. The only answer was to take it with him. As another spear pinged off the shield, he composed a wandering refrain from his notes and attached it beneath the score of the shield. Then he began walking. To his relief, the shield traveled with him, though the effort of putting one boot in front of the other was exhausting. How many of his notes were in his constructs? The symphony did not like to be changed twice in the same manner, and the farther a magus moved a change in the music from its starting point, the harder it was to hold. Fortunately, the pull from the ground was far less here than in the nether. It was the reason one rarely saw pixies flying in the Imperium. Here, however, he bounced along, though each jump tugged at the muscles in his legs. He was breathing far faster than he should be. He'd have to take back the notes of his change soon, and that would leave him defenseless. He was nearing the edge of the battle. 40 more paces. 30. 25. He huffed like an asthmatic festoor. The symphony's resistance to his shield was growing. Oregon looked around. There were still 20 or more warrior pixies close enough to catch him. They were busy chasing the last of their opponents, but once they did that, he knew they would be after him. He heaved his feet forward in another half-hop. 15 paces farther. 10. The shield of heated air compressed in on him, and it grew hotter again in his little bubble. 8 more paces.
By all the ancestors, enough!
He dropped the shield, taking his notes back with a rush of energy, and sprang forward. There were warriors nearby, but his jump caught them off guard. He got 3 more jumps in before they gave chase. Oregon picked up his robe and ran across the dusty plateau toward the ornamented hive.
"Who comes here?"
called a sentry at the hive entrance.
"Oregon Kairasi,"
Oregon gasped, holding a stitch in his side.
Mages of the Houses of Communication and Power, I come to aid you in your war.
The pixie considered him a moment with her large, dark, compound eyes, then the pack of warriors closing swiftly behind him. Oregon knew his crest was spread in all directions, and tried not to clench his hands. They might be chasing him, but this was their eventual destination. He and this sentry had a common cause.
You may pass.
Oregon jumped through the entrance to the hive as a horde of guards rushed to meet the warriors who had chased him. Oregon collapsed against the inside wall of the hive. This was not how he thought helping the pixies would go. Thoughts of being welcomed with a stately ceremony flew from his mind. Thump! The sound was right next to his ear, on the other side of the hive wall. He bolted upright, then glanced out the entrance to see the group that had been chasing him engaged with the less equipped guards from the hive. They weren't the ones making the noise. A shaft of stone thrust through the wall next to his left ear, and Oregon screeched, his crest as wild as if one of his ancestors had appeared in front of him.
What are these walls to be made of?
He said, hopping several steps farther into the hive. Behind him, the stone battering ram jerked and disappeared through the hole it made. He didn't want to know what it had done to the relief sculptures on the outside. He fled inward to repeated thumpings on the walls of the hive. The force he encountered on the plateau must have made their way here after him. The inside of the hive was dry and roomy, cooler than outside, though Oregon still felt his feathers separate from the lack of humidity. The halls were tight for him, and his crest brushed the ceiling, but that was understandable. After all, the standard pixie only came up to his waist. Passages branched off to his left and right, but he headed inward and down. From what little he knew of pixie habitation, the hive mothers were usually at the bottom, and she was the person with whom he needed to speak. Why were they not mobilizing defenses faster? Then he saw the inhabitants, and his steps slowed. He passed through an open area, and the pixies there were dressed in simple coverings, tunics that left their wings free, and belts or harnesses to hold tools and personal items. Many more had leggings crafted from some flat fiber, like overlapping leaves stitched together. They looked comfortable. These people were not ready for war, and might not even have the capability to fight competently. His thoughts went to the pixie he'd talked to, cut down with almost no effort from the warrior faction. Another boom sounded through the hive, and rock and dirt rained down from the ceiling. Pixies yelled and scrambled for the relative safety of the smaller passages. Save for one. Around her, an aura of blue and orange blossomed, and she moved around falling rocks, the orange glow leaving her outstretched hands and gluing sections of the ceiling together. Her extended arms showed that one of her wings was a prosthetic, connected to her body by a set of harnesses wrapping around her torso. Oregon could hear the changes in the symphony of power. They shared that house. Her notes were bolstering the connections amid the particles making up walls and ceiling of the hive. It was as if she was awakening connections the rocks remembered, telling them where they should stay. Oregon stepped toward the magus, and a magus of 2 houses at that. He clumsily followed her example in the symphony, but the music would resist him if he tried to make the same change. Instead, he devoted notes to energizing the connections in the ceiling. Increasing the friction between the separate rocks might be enough to fuse them back into a solid surface. The pixie spared him one glance as they worked. The ceiling of this room was a lost cause for permanent inhabitation, but they could make certain all the civilians escaped to safer parts of the hive. He watched the other pixies flit from the room. When the ceiling was stabilized, Oregon lowered his arms, pulling the sleeves of his now dusty robe down to cover his arms. He'd raised them to the ceiling at some point, though the location of his hands did not actually affect how he changed the symphony.
Good work,
the pixie magus said.
But you come here, why? What does Kyrian have to do with Hive of engineering-minded pixies?
To help, Oregon said. He tried to catch his breath. Most of those changes had been permanent, not reversible. He wouldn't be getting those notes back unless he wanted the ceiling to fall in on him.
The Council is refusing to send anyone to be helping stop this genocide.
The pixie grunted and tilted her head as if to observe a curious specimen of grub, her fingers twitching. Her wings were a blur on her back. The prosthetic seemed just as functional as the flesh and blood one, and she shifted around him in the air, almost too fast for him to follow. Finally, she said,
"You have 2 houses."
That was not what Oregon expected, but he remembered using the symphony of communication somewhere in there to keep a chunk of rock from falling on his head. This pixie did not miss much. From the gnarled edges of the chitinous plates on her head and shoulders, she was older than him, and considering the short lives of the species, that meant she was likely a senior member of the Hive. He stumbled to the left as something larger shook the Hive. Had that been an explosion? He glanced at their recent work, but the ceiling held.
"Come, need to find Mother,"
the pixie said, and buzzed to one of the many entrances to the open area.
2 magi may be enough to change tide of what will happen. 1 will not.
Oregon was caught flat-footed, but leaned forward and half ran, half jumped to catch up. At last, someone who moved as fast as the situation warranted. He caught up with her a few paces down the corridor, and noticed the carvings along the tops of the walls. They were heading in the right direction, which would have taken him too long to figure out, alone.
"Gratificanapoliticavia,"
the pixie said, and Oregon tried to catch the intricacies of the pixie name. Judging by the number of syllables, this one was highly esteemed in her hive. She spun in the air, flying backwards as she observed him.
"Common name is Pratatha. You are Oregon Kairesi, yes?"
For the second time, Oregon was caught off guard. She'd heard of him?
Yes, that is to be accurate," he said. "I am afraid I am not to be familiar with you."
Pratatha waved a small hand as if to dismiss the comment.
"No matter. Good to work with another 2 house mages again. Probably shouldn't have come. This is internal matter to pixies, but since you came, I want to help,"
Oregon broke in.
"The council will not be treating this matter with the attention it deserves. Let me know what I can be doing to help."
He let his crest curl up to show his determination. At least speaking with another magus, there were no barriers in communication. Pratatha turned, picking one corridor out of a 3-way split. Oregon had to admit he would have been completely lost. They'd passed countless doorways, though glimpses of pixies hurrying this way or that were getting less frequent the farther in and down they went.
"Must secure Mother and 1 other. Many engineers will be turned today, but as long as Mother is safe, still have chance at our way of life. I must be admitting I am not fully versed on pixie social customs,"
Oregon admitted.
"Yet still barged in thinking could be a hero,
Pratatha said. Her voice didn't have the sting of accusation, just stating fact.
Yes,"
Oregon said. Fortunately, Pratatha's back was still toward him, so she couldn't see his crest droop in embarrassment.
"This way."
The pixie took another side passage, which looped into a sloping circular tunnel, spiraling sharply down. She explained as Oregon hurried along behind her.
"Pixies are still hive-minded beings, yes?"
Oregon nodded, though she wasn't looking. Pratatha seemed to take his silence for agreement, and continued.
"We wage war less by death and more by...
She paused and swung around in the air to watch him, her compound eyes glittering in the little lights placed in recesses in the rock ceiling.
"More by mind control, if you accept flawed comparison. You are having a collective of like-minded individuals,"
Oregon said, and Pratatha cocked a tiny finger at him.
"Yes, when warriors take over, as have in other hives on the Plateau, many engineering-minded members here will ally. Sort of peer pressure. But the hive mother,"
Oregon prompted.
"Stronger-willed, different genotype from children,"
Pratatha offered. She landed, then walked through a small opening in the tunnel. Oregon had to bend almost double to fit through.
"And you are her child?"
he asked. He would have to talk with other magi in the House of Communication when he returned to the Nether. There were several who would be fascinated with pixie sociology.
"All are here,"
Pratatha answered.
"Though we'll join Warrior Mother when there are more of that influence than of this Hive Mother. So we must be taking the Hive Mother from this place to somewhere safe?"
Oregon asked. Kratatha flew to a doorway trimmed in carvings, coated with what looked like gold and copper, in the glow from bioluminescent lights recessed into the ceiling. She turned, half barring the doorway, then seemed to force herself to relax.
"Must rescue 2 members of Hive to propagate," she said.
Her fingers fidgeted, and she shifted from foot to foot.
"There is to be something you are not telling me,"
Oregon said. He had always wondered how an all-female species reproduced, though some of the others of the 10 species had even stranger ways of reproduction, not something easy and normal like the way Kyrians laid eggs.
"There is,"
Kratatha agreed.
"Shown to very few, not of Pixie's species. Few of our species, in fact."
She moved through the doorway, then beckoned Oregon closer.
"These are his quarters."
Oregon cocked his head at the pronoun use, his crest rising in anticipation. He stepped forward into the room. Inside was a brightly lit mess. There were piles of papers as tall as him, a highly detailed miniature of the hive, including its many layers below ground, a pile of scrolls, and a collection of various drinking vases stacked haphazardly on a table. There were also surgical implements in a glass-fronted cabinet. The occupant of the room was not quite a pixie, or at least not one Oregon was familiar with. Where most pixies had interlocking sections of carapace on their skin, this individual was completely smooth-skinned, and where pixie coloring was in the light blue and green range, this person was beet red and lacked pixie wings. He was hunched over an unrolled scroll, scribbling a line of characters.
"Up, Lauka!"
Kratatha called, slapping her wings together to get the individual's attention.
"Mother needs you. Whole Hive needs you."
Lauka ducked his head farther into the scroll, as if by not looking at them they couldn't see him.
"Warriors coming,"
Kratatha said.
"Dangerous time. We must all move to save Mother."
Lauka continued to write as Kratatha spoke, not even glancing up. Oregon's crest flattened and curved outward. There was something else different about this pixie. Not only that he was a male.
"Must finish calculation, then save Mother,"
Lauka mumbled. Kratatha took a step into the chamber, but Lauka scooted backwards, curling around the scroll, still writing. Kratatha huffed, her wings buzzing in annoyance, though she stood on the floor.
"Males cannot be indoctrinated to another mother," she explained to Oregon. "Unfortunately, also means he's useless to warriors. With lack of connection to larger consciousness means males are harder to deal with. Mystery to all but hive mothers. Often killed when hives taken over."
Oregon was watching Lauka while Kratatha spoke. He was writing furiously, but now he began to beat one hand rhythmically against the wall. Nothing about the gesture showed on his face.
"Have to finish last calculation. Not right yet. Can't leave."
He continued to pound his fist into the wall, even as the other hand wrote.
"If I may help?"
Oregon asked. Kratatha waved a hand for him to continue, as Lauka made no indication he'd heard. There was a growing spot of brownish blood on the wall where the pixie beat his fist into it. There was no emotion shown, but that did not mean there was a lack of emotion. The pixie was likely distressed by them asking him to leave before he finished his work. Oregon dug into the symphony of communication, rearranging notes to remove the rests and make the air thicker. Lauka's hand still thudded against the wall, and he would still receive the satisfaction of the pressure against his hand, but it was harder for him to get up speed. He could still express his concern, but without so much damage. Oregon moved quietly into the room, ducking so he was closer in height to the male pixie. Lauka was even shorter than the female pixies, and with the lack of solid chitinous plates, Oregon guessed he would be more vulnerable to the warriors. When they were little more than hatchlings, Oregon's younger brother Delphorus had a friend similar in some respects to Lauka, though Kyrians differed in presentation.
"Can hear sounds from above," Kratatha said. "Must leave quickly."
Oregon raised a hand to hush her, though she was a senior magus. Kratatha was trying reason, but Lauka had his own priorities. Delphorus learned to work with his friend. It was part of the motivation for Oregon's brother to enter the police academy on Kyria, though their grandmother nearly disowned him in response. Oregon only talked her down by virtue of being trained as an apprentice magus, though even that did not carry the weight he thought it should have with a lauded public speaker like his grandmother. Spiteful old turtle.
"Are you to be familiar with the trader's tongue?"
Oregon asked the pixie, keeping his voice level and calm. Lauka's hand paused for a moment. He nodded, still writing.
"Lauka speaks at least one tongue from every homeworld,"
Kratatha put in. So Oregon might have even been able to speak his native Kyrian dialect. He stayed with the more common trader's tongue. Oregon bent down near Lauka, trying to see the scroll crumpled in his hands, though he wouldn't understand the pixie script.
"Can you be completing this while we walk?"
Lauka made one more mark.
"Efficiency schedule. Not perfect yet. Will come after perfect."
Oregon frowned, his crest flaring out. There wasn't time for that.
"Mill's very good at scheduling and regulation tasks,"
Kratatha offered.
"Important to take burden off Mother. Act as secretaries and planners for Hive. Perhaps if you can be explaining the listed schedule modifications to me, we can work on a solution,"
Oregon said. In the back of his mind, he was counting down the seconds until the warriors would find the most protected part of the hive.
"The warriors are close."
Lauka finally looked up, pointing his multifaceted eyes over Oregon's shoulder.
"Might help. Can explain. Want to know?" "Very much,"
Oregon said. It was an effort to keep his voice level. A Kyrian might pick up on increased agitation, though with Kratatha flitting around as she was, perhaps pixies were not as sensitive.
"What is the problem with the schedule?"
As he spoke, Oregon listened to the changes he'd made in the symphony of communication, taking notes back and rearranging them to move the blanket of air around Lauka. It would provide the feeling of pressure the pixie seemed to want. Oregon added several more notes to the wafting rhythms of the Symphony of Power, similar to what he discovered in the first attack. He changed the pressure of the air by redirecting the heat, making it thicken into a close blanket. It now covered Lauka's lower body, gently pressing in. Oregon could see Lauka relax as he did so. Behind him, Kratatha had her head cocked, likely listening to the changes he'd made in the House of Power, that aspect of the Grand Symphony they shared.
"Have not tried that," she said. "Some others can work with males. Never had time around studies to learn."
"Yes, finish on the way,"
Lauka said, and as he didn't have wings, he pushed to his feet. Oregon shuffled a few of the notes so the blanket of air would follow him. He didn't know how long he would need to hold the change to the symphony, but he was already feeling fatigued. It would only get worse as they traveled from the origin of the change.
"Must take all my papers and equipment,"
Lauka said, shuffling around the room, gathering scrolls until his arms were overloaded and he tottered on his short legs.
"Might have needed equations."
"Don't need all of these, surely,"
Kratatha said. She was buzzing and flitting from spot to spot.
"Only most important ones."
Lauka paused and shook his head as if trying to clear a thought from it. Oregon wondered how often females interacted with male pixies. Kratatha seemed unprepared at best. The females must truly have little to do with the male of the hive.
"Are you having a sack to carry your papers in? Maybe then we can be transporting them all with us."
Oregon carefully kept his crest neutral and turned to give Kratatha a knowing look. He'd want to take all his equations with him, too. It took far too long, but Oregon finally got Lauka out of the chamber with a satchel on his back, filled with scrolls, blueprints, equipment, and papers. He still held his scroll, and Oregon listened with one ear to the explanations of statistical deviations in the modal averages of pixie work times. Occasionally, he offered a suggestion, and Lauka scribbled it down. Kratatha zipped out of the male's room, leading the way to the hive mother's chamber. There were distant thumps as they walked, and Oregon heard the resonances in both the symphonies of communication and power. All of them twitched at the noises, and he stumbled on the flat surface of the tunnel, far more tired than he should be. He needed to take his notes back, but he also knew how much the comfort of a blanket of warm air could help Laoka. Still, if Oregon waited too long, the notes would be lost forever. He hoped he could tell when that was. Rarely in his training in the Nether had he been required to make so many complicated changes so close together. But this was what he had wanted. Although he was tired, this was far more exciting than struggling under what the council said he could and could not do. This was being a magus. Kratatha led them ever deeper, and Laoka followed without looking up, except to ask a question here and there of Oregon. Laoka was close to saving 3 seconds on each pixie's routine, and Oregon would have stopped to delve into the equations deeper himself if the noises had not been getting closer. Instead, he bled off the notes he'd used to make the blanket of air. His strength grew as he did, and Laoka didn't seem to notice.
"Many pathways down to Mother,"
Kratatha said as they walked. These corridors were cooler than the hot, dry air outside, as they were deep within the base of the 5-Hive Plateau. The thumps echoing down from above were less common this deep in the corridors, but they still caused the 3 of them to hunch in at each sound. There were no other pixies in these passages, whether because they were all higher in the hive, fighting the warriors, or down near the mother, Oregon didn't know. In any case, they weren't here. The distance from Laoka's chamber to the hive mother's was not great, and Oregon tried to picture the little wingless pixie scurrying along these passageways to report a discrepancy in this month's work schedule to the mother. The booming and thumping grew louder again as the corridors of the hive grew increasingly extravagant. Oregon drew one thumbnail along a plate of what he thought was pure gold, bolted to the wall. Kratatha put out a hand, and the 3 of them slowed.
"Hush! Close now! Possible that warriors found quicker way down while we were diverted." "Will the mother fight?"
Oregon asked. He tried to imagine a single pixie holding her own. Certainly there would be guards with her. But Kratatha shook her head.
"Mother is concerned only with governing and creating new pixies. No time for combat, and it would not be easy anyway. Mother is constantly gestating new grubs. Fortunate she is between litters, but means she is gravid."
Oregon could see a doorway a few paces down the hallway, outlined in precious metals and stones. He could only spare a moment to appreciate it as Kratatha pulled him toward and then through. He saw with whom they shared the room. Close to the door were a pile of engineer-type pixies, their wings broken. They lay still in death, and puddles of brown blood pooled under them.
"Would have resisted switching allegiance,"
Kratatha explained.
"Too close to Mother."
Laoka hunched along behind them, a low groan coming from him at the carnage. This chamber, in contrast to Laoka's room, was gigantic, easily the biggest in the hive. It was big enough to warrant pillars to keep the ceiling from collapsing. They crept forward, listening to sounds of metal on metal. Then a group of pixies burst from the columns to the left. Oregon saw the same differences from the battle above ground. The engineer pixies were badly outnumbered, outclassed, and outarmed. Before Oregon could do anything more than listen to the symphony, the warrior pixies cut down the last few guards. He and Kratatha might still have an element of surprise if... The warriors turned to them, and Laoka shrieked in surprise.
"Hide!"
Oregon told him. The male pixie wouldn't be able to stand up to those weapons. Oregon wasn't sure he could, either. Laoka bolted for the cover of the nearest columns as the warriors closed in. They were heavily armored, with segmented leather and metal scales over top of their chitin. As they approached, Oregon looked at Kratatha. Her large, multifaceted eyes showed little emotion, in the way a Kyrian's would, but Oregon knew she was ready for this fight. Her hands spread, as if feeling the air. They changed the symphony at the same time. Oregon could hear Kratatha modifying the symphony of power, but what she was doing was deeper in the music than he was used to adjusting, the notes passing by too fast. She charged at the soldiers, the blue of the House of Grace around her feet, hands, and wings, and the orange of the House of Power around her body. She was tweaking connections of some sort between the warriors, and they fell out of formation as she barreled through them, slashing with one hand to knock a cutlass from one warrior's grip. But she hadn't attracted the attention of all the attackers, and a group turned toward him. Oregon raised his hands, though he had never been formally trained in any of the martial arts some beings favored, like the fading hands or dancing step schools. Instead, he groped through the music of communication. These pixies were organized, and embellished musical phrases showed the coordination in their small hand and wing signals to each other. Oregon backed up, staying a constant distance from the warriors and gauging the notes available to him. He had an idea. It was something he'd first thought of in his university physics class. Most of the species in the assembly, except maybe the Benish, as their flesh was of a different makeup than the other species, were vulnerable to rapid changes in air pressure. Especially these pixies, who depended on the air for movement and respiration. Oregon found the melody of the air around the nearest warrior, a turbulent measure, and stripped the notes from it, moving them to a register 3 octaves higher by dint of a few well-placed notes from his core. It was a rapid change, almost too quick for him to handle, but his notes snapped into place. There was an instant when the symphony rang almost painfully inside Oregon's head.
By the ancestors, what have I done?
The warrior exploded in a burst of freezing blue flesh, and Oregon fell back. The two nearest to her remains wobbled in the air, as brown blood leaked from their ear holes and eyes. Both fell to the floor with a crash, and didn't move. Oregon sucked in a deep breath. The cold that chilled him had little to do with the sudden change in the air. He tried, and failed, to push his crest down, then reached up with a shaking hand and flicked a freezing chunk of something from his cheek.
I will not be throwing up.
He hadn't meant to make such a large difference in pressure. He hadn't meant to kill them, just to disorient and maybe knock them out.
If you had not been killing them, they would have killed you.
He knew what went wrong. He only had to lessen the difference in the note's frequency, and there would not be so much pressure difference, especially inside a person. If he ever tried that again, he'd be prepared. He wouldn't kill anyone else. Oregon contemplated fainting for a moment, then straightened. Kratatha and Laoka were still in danger. He should have thought of the possibility of death before coming here, but that feather was already plucked. His crest fanned out wildly as his breathing sped up. He held his breath, then blew it out, turning away from the remains on the floor. This scene would haunt his dreams, but he couldn't dwell on it now. He'd suffer through those nightmares later. Oregon watched Kratatha, who was halfway down the immense hall, a trail of bodies behind her. She was certainly no stranger to death. He had to move. Oregon lifted one boot and half walked, half leaped forward in the homeworld's weak pull. It got easier the farther he got from the death. The Mother's throne was a hulk at the other end of a long hall. As he watched, Kratatha spun in the air, wings buzzing, and a pike thrust through the space where she'd been. She landed in an aura of blue, caught the weapon, and spun it toward a second attacker. The pike glowed in orange, visible only to a magus, and Kratatha jammed it through the smallest crack in the warrior's scale armor. It opened the way as it went in, plunging through her body and exiting out the other side. Oregon swallowed at her violence. Kratatha dropped the handle of the pike as she spun back to the first attacker, jamming one hand tensed like a knife through one of the warrior's compound eyes. The warrior shrieked and fell back. Oregon glanced around. Out of the original 9 warriors, none were left near him. He had killed 3, and Kratatha took another 5 in the same time period. Which meant there was one more. Kratatha jerked and sped forward. He followed. She must have reached the same conclusion. As they got closer, Oregon realized what he thought was the Mother's throne was the Hive Mother herself, sitting on an ornamented stool. She was nearly as large as Oregon, twice as big as the pixies he was familiar with. Behind her, she had another appendage, like a stubby tail, but it throbbed under the blade of a sharp-looking cutlass, held by the last warrior, standing behind the Mother on her throne. From the extra tassels and silver highlights on her armor, she must be the leader of this invasion. The Mother had not called out, as the warrior also had a short knife pressed under her chin.
"Drop weapons! We'll render her sterile!"
The warrior leader threatened, tightening her grip on the hilts of both blades. That explained what the appendage was. Oregon wondered why the threat was to her egg-producing section, and not about the knife under her throat. But Kratitha dropped the dagger she'd picked up. This fierce magus was capitulating so easily?
"Can grow it back,"
Kratitha whispered to him, perhaps seeing his confusion.
"But new pixies she makes will be based on attitude at time of growth. Will no longer be the hive of engineers."
Well, that would never work. Oregon pushed away thoughts of the bodies lying in the hall on the way here. He had to do something. He addressed the warrior in the trader's tongue.
"Will the official censure of the Council of the Magi not be dissuading you from taking over this hive? Both of us are Magi."
He gestured between himself and Kratitha. She spared him a look, but he had not said he represented the council. Let the warrior draw her own conclusions. The warrior rubbed her wings together, making a disparaging sound.
"Have no time for council. They do not play in pixie politics. Have our own Magi, anyway. Warrior's hive is strong." "Mother, are you unharmed?"
Kratitha asked. She glared at the warrior.
"Let her speak. Won't sing while you threaten gestation section."
The warrior hesitated only a moment before nodding and removing the knife for the mother's throat.
"No singing, or I cut this off."
The cutlass waved toward the appendage behind the mother.
"Daughter,"
the hive mother said in a deep, resonant voice, and Kratitha snapped to attention.
"can rebuild in another place. Give sister's daughter what she wants."
"But new sisters will not be engineers, mother,"
Kratitha said.
"Will be civil war until one side wins."
"Yet we will live,"
the mother said. Her voice was low and soothing. Oregon felt it in his toes and listened to the symphony of communication. There was a turbulent cadenza buried deep within. Was this the control the hive mother had over pixies in her vicinity? What did they mean about singing? Even the warrior paid attention when the mother spoke. Yes, Kratitha spoke of the members of this hive converting to the viewpoint of whichever mother controlled them. It must be how so many hives fell under the warrior's influence. Oregon would have to study this later, preferably with a magus of the House of Healing. Oregon stilled one shaking hand on his leg. The analysis helped him forget the sight of the pixie exploding into bits of flesh.
"Don't think about it."
He watched the warrior leader sway, just slightly. How long could she keep her loyalty in this inner sanctum of the engineer's hive?
"Make choices quickly,"
the warrior said, and lifted her blade for the strike that would sever the gestation section of the mother. Aha! Not long, it seemed. Everyone here but him knew exactly how long it took to convert an enemy soldier. It was like when another species tried to compete in a Kyrian philosophical debate. They did not understand the unspoken rules.
"We'll not let you take yet another hive,"
Kratitha said.
"No matter what mother tells you."
The aura of the House of Grace surrounded her, though the other two wouldn't be able to see it. She must have a plan. Oregon could give her time with distraction.
"Why is the warrior hive to be attacking the others anyway?"
he asked.
"Is their drive,"
the mother said.
"Seek to protect, as we strive to build and understand, but has grown and warped over the centuries. Used to be a good thing, but protection has grown into conquering."
The mother's voice was soothing. Oregon could see the warrior struggling not to fall under its sway.
"Warriors first clashed with religious-minded hive. Won, but the feedback and conflict between two mothers mutated. After, warriors expanded too far, too fast. Now they come for us. Think with technology the assembly of species offers. No need for engineering pixies any longer."
The glow around Kratitha centered on her prosthetic wing, and straps slackened. The House of Grace was best at making things more efficient and making objects operate easier. But in this case, he had no idea why she would be loosening her wing.
"Make choices now!"
the warrior called, and waited only a split second before raising her cutlass.
"Too long!"
As the blade swung down, time slowed for Oregon. Several things happened at once. Kratatha spun, throwing the loose wing with the momentum of her body. Oregon just barely got to the correct measure in the symphony of communication in time. He plucked one more of the notes from his core to make a breeze. The wing was designed to fly, and it took little effort to control the surface as a projectile. The wing struck the warrior, knocking her backward, the cutlass shimmering in the lights of the hall as it rose into the air. It reached the top of its arc, hung, and plunged down toward the Hive Mother's gestation section. Oregon's eyes widened, his crest spiking in fear. He imagined a sword piercing the belly of a Kyrian woman, gravid with an egg. But none of them were paying attention to Lauka. The male pixie sprang with a scream from cover behind a thick, carved bench, his satchel clasped in both hands above his head. There was equipment inside, not just papers, for it contacted the falling cutlass solidly, diverting the weapon with a meaty thunk into the warrior's belly. She twitched and dropped, wriggling around the metal, pinning her to the floor. Lauka stumbled toward the corpse as if he would fall on it, his bag raised again. But the mother turned with more speed than Oregon would have thought possible, and brought her clawed foot down on the warrior's head with a crunch. Her leg blocked the male pixie from coming any closer.
"Come to me,"
she said, and Lauka looked from the corpse to the Hive Mother, then sprang into her arms, the top of his head pressed firmly against hers. They stayed that way for a long moment, until Kratatha moved to retrieve her wing, and Oregon discovered he could breathe once again.
"Not safe yet,"
she said. Oregon helped her tie the wing back on, tracing the harnesses which coiled around her body. This close, he could see the veins of blue, green, white, and brown in the prosthetic. There were at least 4 houses of the Magi included in this architecture. It was a fantastically complicated system, a collection of changes to the symphony held in place by the House of Potential.
"More warriors coming,"
Kratatha said, shooing his hands from their investigation of the contraption.
"This was surprise strike, meant to decimate Mother, but larger army will arrive and convert."
"We will go. The back passage."
The mother rose to her feet, and Oregon, for once in his life, found he had to look up to make eye contact with a standing pixie. His crest flared in nervousness. She put Lauka down, and the male pixie patted her hand affectionately, gathering the satchel onto his shoulder again.
"Must retune efficiency calculations,"
he said.
"Intrusion of warriors will interfere with response times."
"I fear you may have to redo all of your calculations,"
Oregon told him.
"I cannot be certain how long until you will be able to return here."
Lauka frowned, for once looking into Oregon's face.
"Then calculations will take quite a while."
The mother did not fly, though her wings buzzed. They were not much larger than a normal-sized pixie's. Maybe they helped her keep her feet, even in the lesser pull from this homeworld. There was little question why Hive Mothers never visited the Nether. She would collapse under her own weight. Kratatha, her wing now reattached, flew in front of the mother and spun in the air.
"Magi first. Will be more warriors at the back passage, surely."
She looked over the mother's shoulder to Oregon.
"You will help, yes?"
She was relying on him. Finally, recognition. Once Oregon returned with the grateful Hive Mother's thanks, the Council would have to listen to his pleas for them to be more involved with the 10 species. His crest rose, and he stumped around the Hive Mother and Lauka.
"I will help. It was to be my intention from the beginning to stop this senseless war as much as I was able." "Good,"
Kratatha answered.
"Keep alert."
They left the back of the mother's chamber and up a sloping tunnel just big enough for Oregon and the mother to pass through. It was steep, aiming directly for the surface. At first they were intersecting corridors, then only dirt and stone, with little ornamentation to tell this connected to the Hive Mother's chamber.
"Made for quick passage,"
Kratatha said as they half-crawled up the passage. The mother was making good time, though her gravid appendage throbbed in time with her labored breathing. Oregon hoped he wouldn't be required to carry the giant pixie. It wouldn't be dignified. Fortunately, they rose quickly, with neither incident from outside forces nor from the mother and Lauka. The male pixie seemed contented to walk by the Hive mother, occasionally touching her hand or shoulder as if to confirm she was still there. At least he had resigned himself to completing his calculations later.
"Not hurt?"
he asked at one point, and the mother responded with a negative.
"Have surgical tools with me, in case."
Oregon's hopes rose as they did. Perhaps they would escape without incident. Now that would be a story to tell the other Magi back at the spire. Above them, a square of orange light grew, and the tunnel grew warmer. Oregon could practically feel the sun beating down on his crest. Dry and scratchy feathers would be worth seeing the Hive mother off to safety. He was visualizing how Kratatha might sponsor some of his ideas to the council. Surely the elder magus had more clout in the House of Power than he did. They emerged from the tunnel to find 1,000 waiting warriors. Oregon froze, his crest spiking. His dreams of showing the council what he had done evaporated as quickly as the moisture in his feathers. He looked to Kratatha, whose hands were clenched in front of her. She looked as if she might dive directly into the army, but not even the House of Grace could save her from that. Oregon felt himself pushed to the side as the mother strode out from their protection. Lauka was riding on her shoulders, yelling at the warriors. He brandished a short dagger he'd gotten somewhere. Kratatha was the first to move, but Oregon found his feet and surged after her, letting the notes of the symphony of communication flow through his mind. There was so much going on. Should he try the pressure trick from the mother's chamber? He knew how to adjust it so it wasn't fatal. He'd never make that mistake again. Oregon began the change, then stopped, shaking his head. There were too many soldiers, and the symphony wouldn't let him repeat the pressure difference too close in time or space. He'd have to find another offensive use of the symphony. Magi were not taught those. Then a low, soothing cadenza flowed up from the bottom of the symphony. It wasn't his doing. Was there a magus among the warriors? He realized what it was. The Hive Mother was singing. It was a powerful song, though in a range Oregon could not physically hear. He tracked its effects in the symphony as the nearest warriors fell from the air, crashing to their knees, their weapons clattering around them. They were genuflecting. No wonder the warrior kept her from singing in the mother's chamber. But the song did not penetrate the entire army, and the warriors farther away drew bows and cocked spears to throw.
"Defend me,"
the mother sang, and the words were low enough for Oregon to comprehend. 7 warriors sprang into the air, one catching 2 arrows with her body, only to fall back dead to the ground. Oregon took the opportunity to close the distance, Kratatha buzzing right beside him.
"You take left!"
she shouted, and Oregon gave a sharp nod, veering to one side of the mother, who was already moving. The mother cleaved a path through kneeling warriors, some of whom popped back up to defend her. Others stayed on the ground, and still others shook their heads and took up their weapons again when the mother passed. Oregon conducted the symphonies of communication and power with the notes from his core. He could hear Kratatha in the music with him, wrapping connections between warriors in perpetual loops of notes. When they shot projectiles, or slashed at the mother's new honor guard, half the attacks went wild. The rest felled their former sisters. The air around Oregon was wild with his attempts to divert the showers of arrows flying toward them. He felt his chest tighten with the effort of tracking 2 symphonies, keeping up with the mother, and not getting stabbed by overzealous pixies. He glanced toward the edge of the army. They were making good time, but the mother's stride lessened with each step. What else could he do? The symphony was resisting his changes. He could only think of so many ways to divert the air. There were only so many combinations of notes. He twisted at a yell from Lauka. He was bent over the mother's shoulders, and she was holding her middle. The shaft of a spear was sticking from her. The male pixie reached down, but his arms were too short to touch the spear from his perch. Faster than thought, Kratatha was in front of her, catching her. The mother's song stopped, and the warriors in her impromptu honor guard were slowing, some already shaking their heads.
"The shield!"
Oregon crowed. He knew there was something he had done, but his travels through the hive had driven it completely out of his head. He reached deep into the rhythms of the symphony of communication to find the melody of a patch of air he hadn't yet touched. The symphony of power was easier, as he'd used it less during their fight to give Kratatha free rein. Oregon pressed the heat away from them and into the growing bubble of air as he poured notes into the music. A spear, and then a patter of arrows, clattered off the hardened air.
"Get her moving!"
he yelled, and pushed the mother, carefully, from behind. The shield was just big enough to encapsulate all of them, and it scooted pixies out of the way as it moved with him. Laoka hopped down from the mother and pulled at her hand. She was bent forward, limping, but Kratatha held her upright. Once they shoved past the edge of the army, the going was easier, though Oregon felt as if he had lumps of lead attached to his boots. The warrior pixies largely didn't follow, though a few buzzed around the shield at all times. He risked a look back and saw the ones nearest the hive rising in the air to stab at something beneath. He hoped the engineer-minded pixies were putting up enough of a fight to let their mother get away. The next stretch of time was the longest in Oregon's life. The effort to keep the shield of air up while they moved was extraordinary. Partway through, he felt Kratatha layering her notes on his, bolstering the effect of his change. Even with her help, there would be a point where he could no longer hold the change. It was another eternity before Kratatha held up a hand.
"Enough!"
There were only 2 warriors still buzzing nearby, and Oregon kept an eye on them as he gratefully dropped the shield of air and heat. Notes rushed back to him, and he regained a little of his strength, but that was like comparing walking the length of the nether to doing it twice. Either one was enough to drain you. Kratatha levered the mother to the ground, then buzzed like a shot toward the warriors. They backed away, turned, and ran. Kratatha came back to them.
"Must attend to her,"
Kratatha told him.
"She is everything."
Oregon bent to the mother's wound. If only he had someone from the House of Healing with him. Laoka crawled forward, taking a complicated-looking device out of his satchel. Oregon had last seen it in the glass-fronted case in his room. Laoka raised it to one compound eye and leaned into the shaft piercing the mother's belly.
"Hands here,"
he said. Then, when no one moved, he waved an arm toward Kratatha.
"Hands here."
He pointed to a spot just beside the shaft.
"Can heal her, Laoka?"
Kratatha asked as she pressed small hands to the mother's belly.
"Possibly,"
Laoka said, then fell silent. His whole attention was focused on the mother's injury. Oregon stood up, watching for more warriors. From the discussion about his efficiency calculation, Oregon knew the male pixie would not rush into something unless he knew he could finish it. They only had to wait until Laoka saved the hive mother. Then Oregon could return to the nether, confident he'd helped.
"The mother was to be saved, though Kratatha and Laoka were not telling me where they would take her,"
Oregon said.
"They advised me to return before they left our improvised campsite that night."
His hands were clasped behind his back to hide their nervous twitching. He hoped his crest wasn't lifting again. His gaze flitted down to the carved image on the front of the table. He wondered if the species of the assembly ever actually worked together as in the depiction. Probably not, as the new figure representing a lobel balanced the void where a figure on the other side had been removed by chisel. People regarded the Eridori as little more than terror stories these days.
"I see,"
said Speaker Karindi, peering down at him from behind the large table in the spire of the Magi. Her crest was flared out in displeasure. "We have complaints coming in from the hive mother of the 5-Hive Plateau," Councillor Huar grumbled. "Seems they don't much like Magi interfering in their business, as we told you." She pulled her floppy hat tighter on her head.
"The warrior hive mother is not to be fully recognized yet by the other hive mounds."
Oregon raised a finger.
"With the engineering hive mother to be safe, there is precedent to—"
Speaker Karindi banged a fist on the top of the table, making the jug of ice water rattle.
There is no precedent for a magus to interfere in a homeworld's internal politics. The Magi cannot always stand apart.
Oregon shot back.
Magus Kratatha.
Magus Kratatha. She already has certain issues in her past record.
Counselor Zana interrupted, and 2 of the other 6 counselors nodded along with him.
She, we do not believe, is a good influence, especially for one of your attitude.
There went any hope of Kratatha sponsoring him in the House of Power.
Then my good work in this case is to be erased?
Oregon asked.
The council will simply ignore that a pixie hive mother would have been murdered if I were not to be interfering? The council cannot recognize such a flagrant abuse of power,
Speaker Karindi said.
Fortunate, the pixie government is not to be bringing a formal complaint before the assembly. Yet.
Oregon leaned into the front of the table, his hands gripping the top. His curved nails bit into the wood.
So I may be clear. The council says it does not recognize an act of altruism, save if there is political gain from it. Is that the official stance of the Magi now? If it serves the greater peace of the assembly, yes.
Speaker Karindi's crest rose with her voice.
You are despicable.
Oregon spat, and as his fingers clenched, he felt a part of the carving crumble under his thumb.
Fitting that the construction is as shoddy as the council's makeup. Be clear, Magus, the speaker said.
Her tone was warning, but Oregon was past caring. That he had made her crest rise was proof of how much he'd twisted her feathers.
If the pixie government does bring grievances against the Magi for this disaster, you will be addressing them on your own, without the council's backing.
Oregon only shook his head. He wasn't afraid of the council or the pixie government. From what he'd seen, both had too much to fix internally to bother going after one magus.
For you, there will be a permanent note going in the council records of your actions, Counselor Zana added. You are young. The council, we hope you will grow out of this phase.
A phase? Oregon pushed away from the table with a bark of a laugh. That's what they thought this was. He'd show them how much of a phase wanting to help the homeworlds was.
Then if we have nothing more to discuss, I will take my leave,
he said, letting his crest fluff out in disdain. Off with you, pup, Counselor Huar said, and waved a hand at him. Don't come back here without a good reason. Oregon turned and left, silently, his hands clenched into knots. Now he knew the true heart of the council. But they were old, and he was still young. He had many cycles ahead of him as a magus, and plenty of time to find other magi who shared his views. Other counselors would rise in time. He'd be there to make sure they served the great assembly of species, and not just themselves. Back in his apartment, Oregon placed the detailed model of the hive on his shelf. It was a gift from Lauka, when the mother came through her field surgery successfully. Why Lauka lugged it from his room, Oregon didn't know, but the little pixie's hands trembled when he'd given it away. Pixies didn't cry, not with those compound eyes, but if they did, he was sure Lauka would have been. Kratatha promised to see the hive mother to a new place, where she could begin anew. It had been a surprise to see the extra section the mother carried dispense a mass of squirming grubs into the dusty plateau. The stress of the surgery was too much to keep the gravid sac and to keep breathing. They held a burial for Kratatha's unborn sisters, but Lauka promised the mother would be well after that. The hive mother added her own thanks, her voice weak, but resonant in the symphony. Oregon hoped a new generation of engineer pixies could challenge the warriors of the 5-hive plateau, but it would be many cycles coming. Considering pixies' lifespans, it might even be the mother's successor who came back into the political scene. It wasn't Oregon's fight. However, showing the Magi the true stripe of the council's feathers was. Oregon had too many eyes on him now to keep track of the pixies, but he wouldn't have traded this adventure for anything. He knew what Magi should do, even if many others didn't. He'd just have to search out the others like him, the ones willing to go out into the 10 homeworlds, rather than sitting like turtles in their shells, here in the Nether. This is the end of The 5 Hive Plateau. If you enjoyed this story, check out the other Dissolution Verse books in audio, ebook, and print on Amazon.com. If you enjoyed this recording, why not try out The Seeds of Dissolution, available on audio and at Chirp Books at www.chirpbooks.com/audiobooks and search for The Seeds of Dissolution by William C. Tracy.